Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The lecture will begin very soon, so kindly return to your seats. We would like to seek your cooperation to have your mobile phones switched to silent mode. During the Q&A session, participants may proceed to the standing mics to field your questions. Please keep your questions comprehensive and condensed. We would appreciate if you could spare a few minutes to fill in the feedback form, and you may drop the completed form at the registration counter outside. Lastly, copies of the book Political Order and Political Delay by Prof. Fukuyama are available for sale outside the ballroom. Each copy is retailing for $35, and you may have your book signed by the author after the lecture. Should you have any inquiries, you may approach any of our staff. Thank you very much and have a very good evening.
Good afternoon. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome this sellout crowd to this amazing event. You can see that we moved it to the Raffles Town Club because we couldn't find a room big enough at our school to accommodate this amazing number of people who have turned up. And for those of you who've come to our school before, you know I can only make 3 points when I introduce an event. And the first point I'm going to make, of course, is that in many ways, the subject that we're here to discuss, political order and political decay, and the challenges of governance in US, China, and the rest of the world, is of course a subject that is strategically aligned with the mission of the Lee Kuan Yew School, because we were set up in 2004 with the mission of improving governance in Asia and beyond. So it is for us a great pleasure and honor, therefore, to have an event like this to reiterate the missions and goals of the school. And some of you may know that only 20% of our students come from Singapore, 80% come from the rest of the world. An ideal classroom for us to be something like 20% Singapore, 20% Southeast Asia, 20% India, 20% China, 20% the rest of the world. And of course, we can only do this through the generous support of our benefactors. We are delighted that today's lecture is part of the S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecture Series. He's been a very strong supporter of the school. Indeed, he donated $20 million to us, the Lee Foundation, on the event of our 10th anniversary last year. So if you don't mind, let's begin with a round of applause for Dr. S.T. Lee and the Lee Foundation. My second point is about the topic, and I can't think of a more timely subject to discuss today, because I find as I travel around the world, everywhere around the world, there are great concerns about how we try to create long-lasting political order and stability in our societies. Indeed, I was in Davos last week and came back on Monday morning, and as you walk the corridors and you get the sense of foreboding about the future. This was just before the Greek elections, and people were wondering what's going to happen, will the Eurozone continue, what will happen to the European Union, so all kinds of fairly fundamental questions, and also stretching to, of course, to other societies and other regions and so on and so forth. So this is a subject that is of great global interest. In fact, the interest in the subject is demonstrated also by the size of the audience that we have today. But frankly, and this is my third point, I suspect the real reason why we have this remarkable audience today is that we do have a superstar in our room, and his name is Francis Fukuyama. And the remarkable thing about Frank is that he became successful at a relatively young age. In fact, several decades ago, as you know, with his famous essay, The End of History, which has become one of the most iconic essays of all time, and quoted, referenced, mentioned. And I want to tell you, Frank, it was actually mentioned in Davos last week again in several discussions. And normally, when you succeed young, there's a great temptation to rest on your laurels. And as the Guardian review, and I was telling Frank this, of Frank's work, saying people who succeed early, want to retire early, join the lecture circuit, hobnob with the rich and famous. That's what successful people do. But Frank chose the opposite path. He actually decided he wanted to produce many serious books for us to reflect on. You've heard of his book on trust, And now, as you can see, in the last few years, he's produced the last 2 volumes, which are having an enormous impact around the world. So as a result of all his many hours, he tells me he writes 7 mornings a week. I wish I could do that too. And produce these remarkable pieces of work which are now studied, quoted, discussed, cited all over the world. It is therefore a great privilege for our school that we are able to welcome Frank once again to address an audience of the school. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Frank, to the podium.
Well, thank you. That's really an extremely generous introduction. Kishore is an old friend of mine. We've been sparring intellectually for decades now, but it's a really great pleasure to be here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I love public policy schools, and this is really one of the best ones in the world. I've been here actually to teach a course around a curriculum that I helped to develop aimed at public officials from developing countries, and I know a number of the students in that course are in this audience, but this is a perfect place to do this, and I really do appreciate the hospitality of the school and the backing of the donors that make it all possible, and I'm really appreciative of having this audience tonight to do this S.T. Lee lecture. Great honor. So let me begin my talk. The themes come out of the last book that I just published in the fall called Political Order and Political Decay. It's part of a 2-volume series on the origin and the evolution and the decay of political institutions. I think the easiest way to start the subject is just to talk about the world in the year 2015. It's been a very problematic world. Now, Kishore has pointed out that in this immediate area, things are actually looking, in a way fairly optimistic, but there are large parts of the world where things have fallen apart in many respects. In the Eurasian continent, the world is actually, in a certain way, more stable and better organized than in the Middle East. And those 2 worlds, I think, are part of the theme of what I'm going to tell you tonight. So at either end of Eurasia, you have 2 big powers, Russia and China, that are organized around centralized states. They can project power. They have ambitions. They're territorially, I think, in many respects, on the move. And that world is actually quite a familiar one. It's the world of the 19th and 20th centuries where international relations focused around great powers and their interactions. But there's another part of the world that is very, very different. This part of the world begins in North Africa, goes through sub-Saharan Africa, through the Arab Middle East, through Pakistan, really up until the borders of India. And that world has been characterized for some time by the absence of coherent states or by states that are extremely weak. And we've seen since the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, the almost complete state failure of 4 Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, which is an unprecedented situation. We've seen the growth of groups like the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. It is my opinion, and we can talk about this in the discussion afterwards or in the question and answer period, I continue to feel, despite the daily beheadings and terrorist bombings and so forth, that ISIS is actually, in the end, not that powerful a political organization, and that the reason that it's allowed, that it's been able to expand is that everybody else around it is so weak, that this is a kind of group that ought to be controllable by organized states, but there are no organized states in that immediate neighborhood. If you think about Islamic radical groups elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, you have Boko Haram in northern Nigeria that is on a kind of rampage right now, doing tremendous damage, but the only reason I think that they can do this is that the Nigerian state is highly corrupt, very ineffective, very low capacity, and they've still, to this point, not managed to mount or to do the things that a state is basically supposed to do, which is to protect its own population. And in many respects, American foreign policy has been very much shaped by state weakness in this region. The United States invaded two Middle Eastern countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, but immediately found that the task was not the traditional one of fighting another state. It was to actually build state authority so that those states could be coherent projectors of power and protect their own populations. And I would say that after some almost 13 and a half years since September 11th, the United States has learned that it's not very good at this, that it really doesn't know how to construct state authority. And I think the legacy that it's left in these two countries is a very problematic one. And the underlying solution of terrorism is in many ways worse now than it was on September 11th, 2001. And so this is a very big dilemma in the world. Where does it come from? I've labeled in my books this problem as the problem of getting to Denmark, where Denmark is not the actual country Denmark. It's kind of a symbolic place that is stable, prosperous, democratic, secure, with very low levels of corruption. And the international community more broadly has been trying to turn places like Haiti and Somalia and Afghanistan into some version of Denmark, and they've been completely unsuccessful at this. Now, I actually happen to have a visiting professorship at a Danish university for several years, and I would say most Danes actually themselves don't understand how they got to be Denmark, so perhaps it's not that big a surprise that America this happened, but I think it's revealing of the fact that we who live in reasonably stable, developed countries take our political institutions for granted. We assume that there will be a monopoly of force and that there will be basic citizen security, and we don't really know how it came about that this sort of thing happened in the first place. I think that Americans in particular have a certain blindness, greater blindness about this than people from other parts of the world, because in the American tradition, democracy and law have been such important political aspects of American political identity, these constraints on state power, that we sometimes forget that before you constrain power, you have to create it in the first place. And that's the part that we're not terribly good at. So let me set the stage. I'm eventually going to get to China and the United States, but I need to set the stage by setting a conceptual framework for how to think about this question of political institutions. In my view, you have three baskets of institutions around which any modern political order in one way or another needs to revolve. And these institutions are, in some sense, in tension with one another, which is why modern politics is difficult. The first of these institutions is the state. The sociologist Max Weber defined the state as a legitimate monopoly of force over territory. I think this is a good definition because that is, in fact, the unique thing that states do. They concentrate and deploy power in order to protect their population from domestic and internal threats. They provide necessary public goods. They provide services, infrastructure, health, and the like. But the important thing about the state is actually the power part. States are about power. States are about the ability to generate and use power. The second basket of institutions is what's called the rule of law. Now, you can distinguish between rule by law and rule of law. So rule by law is simply commands of the executive. The king or the prime minister tells the citizens to do it, and they do it. Rule of law has to apply to the executive itself, otherwise it's not the rule of law. So if the king, the president, the prime minister can make up the rules as they go along, then that is not the rule of law. So the rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on power. It limits what that powerful state can do and ensures that it operates according to a set of rules that are agreed to by the community. And finally, the third basket of institutions has to do with institutions of accountability. In the West, we associate these with a set of procedures, free and fair multi-party elections, but I think it's important to note, especially here in Asia, that the goal of the procedures is substantive accountability, meaning that the political system ought to respond to the interest of the whole community and not just to the private interests of the people running the government. So in that structure, in this tripartite structure, you have one institution, the state, that is trying to accumulate and use power, and two other institutions, the rule of law and democratic accountability, that are limitations on power, that are constraints on power. And this is why there is an inherent tension in a modern system, because from one extreme to the other, you're not going to have either a just or a sustainable kind of political system. So if you have a state that is extremely powerful, you can do certain things with that power, but without constraint, it becomes a dictatorship. On the other hand, if you don't have a state and you only have instruments of constraint, then at one extreme you have anarchy, you have Syria or Libya. But even if you do have a kind of minimal state, if all you have is constraint, your citizens aren't going to be very happy, because governments are actually supposed to do things. They're actually supposed to provide services and the like. Now, final important distinction is between what, again, Max Weber called a patrimonial state and a modern state. And I think this is actually the one definition that you really need to take home with you, because it's very important. A patrimonial state is a state where the rulers regard the state as a species of private property. So in the old days, when you had kings and queens, the king could give away a province to his daughter as a wedding present, including all the inhabitants that lived in that province, because he literally owned his realm. Now today, nobody dares to say, I own my country. So we have what political scientists label neo-patrimonialism, which is a society, a political order in which there's the outward appearance of being a modern state with a bureaucracy and a prime ministership or a presidency and so forth. But the reality is that that political system is being run for the private benefit of the people running the system. And the reason that they are in politics is to enrich themselves privately. That's neo-patrimonialism. And both traditional and neo-patrimonialism need to be distinguished from a modern state. A modern state makes a clear distinction between public and private, and it says that the state itself serves a public interest and it serves it impersonally. Your relationship to the state does not depend on whether you're the cousin of the prime minister. It depends on whether you are a citizen and you are supposed to be treated equally by that state. And the state is supposed to keep its interest, the public interest, separate from the private interest of the rulers. Now, I would say that if you look at the history of political development in the last couple of generations, it's actually much easier to develop democratic institutions of accountability than it is to develop a modern state, to make that transition from a traditional to a modern state. And I think you can see that in American actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the United States invaded these countries. It tried to establish new political institutions. It managed to hold elections in both countries, or at least election-like events that produced governments that had some degree of democratic legitimacy. But what it was really unable to do was to actually create modern states, that is to say, impersonal, uncorrupt, effective state institutions that could protect their populations, that could deliver services on an impersonal basis. That was the really big failure. I would say that actually the big division in the world right now is less between authoritarian and democratic states than between patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states on the one hand and modern states on the other. I'll give you several examples of that. So let's take the conflict in Ukraine. What is it that all of these young protesters in Kiev were upset about, and why did they want to associate themselves with the European Union rather than Russia? It really didn't have to do with democracy, because Viktor Yanukovych, the president that was forced out last winter, was democratically elected, and I think everybody in Ukraine admitted that. What they did not like was that he was presiding over a kleptocracy in which he and his family personally benefited to the tune. I mean, we don't know how much money he managed to get out of the country, but it was a very substantial amount, and it was a typical regime that was being run for the private benefit of the insiders. You may have seen the picture of this gigantic palace he built for himself outside of Kiev, which was just, one manifestation of that. And so the choice was really not between authoritarianism and democracy. The choice, what Europe symbolized to these Ukrainians was that we want to live in a country in which the government actually serves public purposes and not the private interest of a clique of insiders. And I would argue that that's really the source of the conflict between the West right now and Vladimir Putin in Russia, because he is similarly presiding over this kind of insider-dominated, rent-seeking, corrupt empire, and that's the fundamental principle. It's not democracy. Vladimir Putin, if there's an election tomorrow, would probably get 70-80% of Russians to vote for him. So the real distinction is that distinction between a modern, effective state and a patrimonial one. Another example would be India. So in the late 1990s, Jean Drèze, who's an economist and an activist, did a survey of some northern Indian states, some relatively poor states. He discovered that despite the fact that they were getting paid 50% of the school teachers in the publicly funded elementary schools didn't show up for work on a day-to-day basis. So this caused a tremendous outcry in the Indian press. India is a very healthy democracy. It's got a lot of information. There's opposition parties. People got very upset. There wasn't anybody in India who argued in principle that teachers ought to get paid and not show up for work. So there's attempted reform efforts, and after 10 years, they do another survey, and it turns out that exactly the same percentage, 50% of teachers, are not showing up at their jobs. This is bad for India. It increases inequality in a society that is already very unequal. It harms Indian competitiveness. There's nobody in India that thinks that this is a good idea, and yet reforming that public education system seems to be beyond the capacity of the public officials and the governance system in that very lively democracy. And I would say that that is one of the reasons that Narendra Modi was elected in the BJP Prime Minister of India, because Indians, I think, at this point were just exasperated that their government can't do anything. They want strong leadership, and they're hoping that he will give it to them. Final example is closer to Europe, which is Greece. So Greece was ruled for a brief period by a junta of colonels. They stepped down in 1974. Greece returned to being a democracy, and it's been a pretty successful democracy. So two parties, PASOK and New Democracy, have changed places numerous times. There's lots of political competition. The problem with Greece, however, was that these two parties competed on the basis of their ability to provide their supporters with jobs in the public sector. And because you can't fire civil servants in Greece, every time one party would replace the other after an election, it would expand the payroll of teachers or bank employees or other kinds of public officials to the point that they had something like 7 times the number of public servants per capita that Britain did. And one of the reasons that they got into big trouble during the Euro crisis was they couldn't control the wage bill of their public sector. And even after all of the external pressure by the Troika, this is still a practice that the Greek political parties have been very, very reluctant to give up. And so all of this indicates that, one of the themes, so I think that democracy in many respects has not been doing well in many parts of the world. Many of these democratic transitions have not worked well. And I would say that there is a kind of common cause to all of this, which is this failure, this inability to deliver on basic governance. And by the way, this is why schools like the Lee Kuan Yew School are very important because this is really a central task. That, as I said, in many ways, democracy is much easier to implement as an institution than is high-quality governance and the deliverance of these basic services that are really the core of why people want to live under governments. So that's the general framework that I try to develop in the book, the importance of administration of states, of modern states. Let me turn to the specific comparison between China and the United States, because in many respects I think that these two countries are at the opposite ends of a certain spectrum. So if you remember, there's three institutions. There's the state, the rule of law, and accountability. And in my view, a well-governed country has to balance these. So China is at one end of the spectrum. China has got the oldest modern state tradition of any society in the world. I argued in the first volume of my book, in fact, that that Western scholars have failed to recognize the fact that the Chinese were the first to actually invent not just a state. They didn't invent the state, but they invented the modern state. That is to say, a state that was centralized, bureaucratic, based on merit and expertise, and that they did this at the time of the Qin unification in the 3rd century BC. And so they actually beat any European society to this by about 1800 years. The problem in China is that they never developed the institutions of constraint. They never developed a real rule of law, and of course they do not, to this day, have anything that looks like democracy. And so in their history, they're very good at doing things that states do, but their problem is dictatorship, that the state is too powerful. The United States, by contrast, is kind of at the opposite end of that spectrum. Not that it's chaotic, but the deepest American traditions have to do with suspicion of government power. The United States was born in a revolution against the British monarchy and parliament, and therefore the founding fathers created a very complex system of checks and balances by which power would be divided and internally balanced against itself. And in many respects, I think a lot of the problems in American politics right now is that check and balance system has become a little bit too effective, that the power, it's difficult to exercise power. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. So China invented the modern state. They did this for reasons that the sociologist Charles Tilly identified in his well-known book on war and state-making in early modern Europe. That is to say, in the spring and autumn period and the warring states period in ancient China, this period from roughly 700 to about 200 BC, 500-year period, China went from having about 1,200 states to, at the time of the warring states, about 16 and then to 7 and finally to 1, where a single political entity unified the whole of what was then China, the western state of Qin, beginning the Qin dynasty and the history of a unified modern Chinese empire. The reasons that China invented state modernity are very similar to what happened in early modern Europe, that war created enormous pressures for raising revenue, taxes. You needed a bureaucracy in order to raise those taxes. And because of this remorseless military competition, the principle of meritocracy became very important. If you hired your cousin as a general, you would lose the war, and you would get slaughtered, and your whole family, your whole lineage would get slaughtered. And so there's a very powerful incentive to reward expertise in government. And in a certain way, that's been the Chinese legacy ever since then. So subsequent Chinese history after the Qin unification, the dynasty falls apart. After a few centuries, there's a period of extended confusion, but China's default position is to reunify as a centralized bureaucratic state. By the way, it's almost the mirror image of India, because just as China the default condition was to be a centralized bureaucratic state, India's default position was to be a disunified collection of small principalities, periodically unified for brief periods of time. And I think that, that contrast still exists in the contrast between the governments of the two societies. Now, in my view, the current government that is presided over by the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party, has many similarities to dynastic China and many of the same problems of governance in that kind of a bureaucratic society. The big problem, if you try to run a very large, geographically and physically large society from centralized government, is a problem of information. You don't know what's going on in your own society, and this was a problem in ancient China. That's why they had to delegate a lot of authority. But because you didn't have any local feedback loops, the government constantly had to pile centralized institutions of control one on top of another. So you had a bureaucracy, which was the primary instrument of rule, but then you couldn't trust the bureaucrats, so you had to have a corps of eunuchs in the palace that watched over the bureaucrats, but then you couldn't trust the eunuchs, so you had to create a eunuch rectification office to make sure that the eunuchs were behaving themselves. And in many respects, I think this is the problem of the Chinese Communist Party, that they need to control a very large, complex society. Their main instrument is the Communist Party, but within the party, you can't trust the party members, and so you have to have an organization department, and then you have to have more and more instruments piled on top of each other to keep this whole hierarchy going. If I can just give you a very brief balance sheet of what I think are the advantages and disadvantages of Chinese government, I would say the following: that the positive things that China has done since 1978 are very clear. One is rule-based decision-making. China does not have rule of law, and in fact, one of the deepest traditions in China, the argument between the legalists and the Confucians was that the legalists said we have to have clear laws and rules, and the Confucians said no set of rules is ever going to be sufficient to define all outcomes. Therefore, you need to grant discretion to a wise ruler who can judge the context and make decisions that are more suited to the actual situation. And one of the deep differences between China and the West is that the Chinese have always come down on the side of discretion rather than strict rules, and this has been the case in China. Nonetheless, since 1978, there's been a spread of rule-based decision-making. It falls short of the rule of law. The Chinese Communist Party makes the Constitution. The Constitution does not limit the party. Nonetheless, they have accepted rules on their own behavior. So one of the most important things they've done is term limits and retirement ages. So there's a 10-year cycle after which we're now in the third of these since Deng Xiaoping, in which the leadership steps down. If Mubarak or Gaddafi or Ben Ali or any of these Arab dictators had stepped down after 10 years, I think they would be very fondly remembered right now. And the Chinese, have come to a system not really of constitutionalism, but of rules that increasingly govern their behavior. Second important advantage is institutional autonomy. This is actually one of the things that you can do in a dictatorially run society. You can make big decisions, big complex decisions, and you can implement them very quickly. So you think about what Deng Xiaoping did after 1978 to shift from a command economy to a marketized economy. No democracy could have done this remotely as quickly as he was able to do because of this concentration of power at the top. And so it's power that can be used under the right circumstances for very good purposes. Disadvantages of the system, I think, are pretty clear. You don't have instruments of constraint, and you've got this big problem of information. And so simply knowing what's going on in the society, just as in dynastic China, is a really big problem. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't subject itself to elections, which is the normal feedback loop in a democracy to find out what's going on and what citizens are unhappy about. And so they have to resort to polling and to, they follow the internet, partly to see what people are unhappy about, and they respond to demonstrations and outbreaks of violence, of which, there are several thousand in China every single year. because that's really the way that people can express their unhappiness. But it's a very imperfect system because you don't have downward political accountability. And then the final two problems, I think, are probably more severe. One is a problem of legitimacy. So China still bases itself on Marxism-Leninism explicitly, but nobody really seems to believe in that. They would like to resurrect an older Chinese Confucian tradition, but that is really not compatible with Marxism-Leninism in any kind of open way, and therefore the default source of legitimacy is performance. But that's a weakness in the long run, because if the performance falters, then the legitimacy is going to falter. Then finally, the bad emperor problem. Problem with unconstrained political power is that periodically you get bad emperors. If you have a good emperor, I would say Singapore had a great emperor for a while, you can do wonders. You can be much more efficient and quick and effective than a democratic society with all the checks and balances and coalitions and interest groups. But the problem is, every now and then you get a really bad emperor. And I would say that if I were a Chinese person, the thing I would worry about right now under the current leadership is that the current leader has accumulated more personal power than virtually any other leader since Deng Xiaoping, and maybe he'll go on to get even more of that. And you don't really know whether he's going to be a good emperor or a bad emperor. It could go either way. I think it's too early to pass judgment on that, but it could go either way. Let me conclude by saying something about the United States, because as I said, we're at the other end of the spectrum. Our problem is the following. It's the intersection of two developments. So the one development is in American society. American society is extremely polarized. For most of the 20th century, the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, overlapped very substantially. But since the late 1980s, they have split apart, and there's no overlap whatsoever. So that the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. That's one thing. Another is the rise of extremely well-organized and very well-resourced interest groups, which the American Supreme Court, in its great wisdom, has said is simply an aspect of free speech and therefore protected by the Constitution. Now, that's one set of developments which in a parliamentary system wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but our institutional setup is one of these very complex checks and balances in which power is split between a large number of different bodies within the government. And when you combine the polarization and the interest groups with this check and balance system, you get something that I label a vetocracy, meaning that it is extremely easy for minority groups, well-organized minorities, to veto things that are in the general public interest but against their short-term interest. I mean, we can discuss this further in the Q&A, but I think the most obvious example of this is our failure to adequately regulate our banks, because the banks are really rich and they're very powerful, and in a certain sense they've, I think, shown that they're more powerful than the US government over the last few years. But there are other manifestations of this. I mean, the failure of Congress to pass a budget really since 2008, a tax code that is full of privileges rather than clear-cut liberties, and a general inability of the Congress to deal seriously with the problems of governance that faces the United States. Now, I will conclude by just making some observations. I do not think that there is, first of all, I don't think that America as a whole is in decline. America is the only developed country that's growing. I mean, it's growing pretty well, and there's still a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation in energy, in where I live in Silicon Valley, in high technology, in a number of areas. The problem is really in American government. That's where I think we've really got decay and some problems. I also don't think that there's a general problem with democracy, because there are actually quite a number of democracies around the world that have done pretty well in the last few years. Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, they've all made very difficult decisions. They've balanced budgets and gotten more labor flexibility and so forth, and managed to achieve consensus. I think the problem that I'm describing is actually quite specific to the United States and a few other countries, maybe Japan, maybe Italy, and some others. So there's no general crisis, but it is important because what happens in the United States, I think, matters around the world because the United States is seen as a model to other countries. So I'm not going to conclude by making any predictions whatsoever about which of these systems is going to end up on top. I've learned after many long years to stay away from that sort of thing. But I do think that this is a way of thinking about the world, that institutions do decay, they get renewed, so it's not a necessarily downhill slide, and Chinese institutions are also sticky, and so we don't know what the future is going to hold for them. But that's a way to think about, the political dilemmas, I think, that we see in our contemporary world. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Frank. You mentioned at the beginning that we've been sparring for decades, so I'm going to start by asking you a couple of difficult questions before I throw the floor open. Thank you, Anthony, for lining up. You mentioned we all want to get to Denmark, but assume that we are now Libya, trying to get Denmark, and you look at the countries that are getting to Denmark, whether it's South Korea or Singapore and other places. One reason why they got there is because they had a very strong leader who just focused on getting the job done and said, I want to fix my country. So if someone like that arrived in Libya and suspended all the civil liberties, would you say, hey, that's exactly what Libya needs to do?
Well, so it's absolutely correct that of those three institutions, the first thing that Libya needs is a state.
Yeah.
They have to have a state. But then the question is, how do you get to a legitimate state? Because if you're just a strong man that is simply using force to knock heads and produce order, you will have a state that will last for a certain amount of time, but it will lack, and the problem in Libya is that the two, halves of northern Libya are divided tribally and in a lot of regionally and a lot of other ways, and you're not going to have peace in that country unless there's some kind of a reconciliation. And so the leader, that is if you have a strongman leader, that leader is going to have to figure out how to bridge that gap. They're not going to be legitimate unless they do that. They don't have to be democratic necessarily, but they've got to be legitimate in the sense of being accepted by the two halves of this extremely divided society. So yes, I would say, so I know what you want to do. You want to get me to say, yes, I think we need a strong man like,
like I tried.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm willing to concede that in certain circumstances it is, another case of that is what's just happened in Sri Lanka, which is actually kind of an amazing story. So you had this terrible civil war between the Buddhist and the Tamil community. The Buddhist community won that war, but then you had this strong man, Mr. Rajapaksa, who basically was not interested in actually building a legitimate state on the basis of that victory. And he's now been voted out of office because I think there's a realization that you can't have legitimate authority unless you have this kind of reconciliation. So that's why I think the strong man by himself is, that's a starting point, but it's not nearly enough to actually produce real order.
But at the same time, just to quickly it's very difficult to defend Rajapaksa, but if you had gone to Sri Lanka when the bombs were going off, there's no way that Sri Lanka could have succeeded with the bombs going off all the time. You needed someone to switch off the bombs, and he switched off the bombs. And so in that sense, getting the primary order right is a critical thing. Now, quick second question on the United States. And see, in many ways, the United States has always projected itself as a model for the rest of the world, has always said, if you want to succeed, follow us. But now, with what you call the vetocracy, and what it also means is that, in theory, as you say, rule of law means that the public interest is taken care of and not sectoral interest taken care of. But in America, you do have rule of law, but it ends up with sectoral interest being given priority over the larger public interest. So doesn't that mean that in some ways, you also got to qualify whether or not America really has the rule of law it needs?
Well, so I think what is necessary is balance. That is to say, you need state power and you need to constrain state power, and I think that both law and American democracy have provided too many constraints. So even in the realm of law, there's a large section on my book about the fact that in American law, we don't rely on the state to enforce laws. We rely on private individuals who can sue the state, to stop it from doing something or to make it do something, and the result is very, very inefficient. That's why we have so many lawyers and this explosion of lawsuits and so forth. And so that's another example of excessive division of power. And so I think some of that needs to be walked back so that you can make decisions a little bit more efficiently.
But to do that, you've got to persuade the U.S. Supreme Court to change the ruling, right?
Yeah, and so this is, I think, another aspect of political decay, is that all institutions have to adapt. And we've kind of put these straitjackets on ourselves that make it hard to adjust our institutions to present circumstances.
Okay, by the way, I want to remind you all that Frank is going to sign his book outside, so please buy as many copies as you can. So Anthony, you get the first question, and those with questions, please come to the microphone, line up, please. Please go to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Dean. 50 years ago, when Gilas Milovan wrote a book like Political Decay in Yugoslavia, Tito jailed him. Times have changed. You can speak here quite openly. But about in the 90s, in the same place in Yugoslavia, Madeleine Albright has a very interesting proposition. And she said, if the US is so powerful, why don't you use your military power? And she said that to Colin Powell. And to me, that is like the Albright proposition. So as you see it in Libya, the Obama regime bombed them. In ISIS, they bombed them. But in a previous time, when the lukewarm proposition says, give war a chance, Bush went to war. But the point is this, when you talk about China, US, Japan, Russia, political decay, then you come to the issue of the chemistry of it. And the chemistry of it is, if there is political decay, then what is the risk of spontaneous combustion? Because you have the Russian who is behaving like Catherine the Great, collector of the earth. He just collected Crimea. You have Xi Jinping just saying to the PLA, for maybe domestic consumption, prepare for war. You have a new defense minister in Japan who says he doesn't mind preemption, which is a radical change from times past. So
Anthony, you have to ask your questions.
the question is, what is the risk of spontaneous combustion in the decay?
Well, I think that the world is pretty dangerous right now, actually. I wouldn't predict war in East Asia, but the whole relationship of China to both other countries in Southeast Asia and to Japan is very troubling because, it's this classic case of a rising power that is changing the distribution of power in the international system, and it's very hard for everybody to adjust to that. And so I have been quite worried. I'm sure that neither Japan nor China or Vietnam wants war, but neither did anybody in 1914 either, and yet you got into a war. I think there is a war going on in Ukraine right now. I mean, there's an active shooting war going on in Ukraine, and that is also potentially very destabilizing because the whole post-1991 territorial settlement in Europe was based on this idea that if you're a Russian living outside of Russia, you would just stay there. And now Putin has basically told them, no, in fact, you're going to get help from Russia. So I think it's a very troubling situation, and I think that we risk a lot of conflict.
Okay, Frank, as usual, I see lots of questions. I'm going to take 3 at a time. If you don't mind, you can take notes, okay? So I'm going to take the 1, 2, 3, the first 3 mics, then I'll come to the back mics later, please.
Hello, Professor. My name is Manmeet Singh Aluwalia. I am from India. We've just come for 1 week of executive learning program in the Lee Kuan University. And yesterday in our seminar, we were told that Professor Francis Fukuyama is about to come. So I just made my way through. And I'm thankful to you to deliver this lecture. I have many questions, but I'll start with one. Because this is what I have observed in Singapore in the past 3 days when we talk about democracy. My question to you, Professor, is that will democracy and freedom of press go together? Or democracy can sustain itself without giving the citizens the right for the freedom of expression? Because I was amazed by the analogy you brought forward. I think a couple of people chuckled during the seminar when you said, I don't know, time will tell if he's a good emperor or a bad emperor. And somehow what appeared to me in the Singaporean cases, I will apologize if I offend some sentiments, but I have been told about this that the Singaporean government is semi-autocratic. And that has been labeled in the press, in the media, everywhere. They say they don't allow the freedom of press to survive. And when I ask people in the corridor, especially Singaporean youth, about the future of Singapore, and they always talk hush-hush, they're like, okay, we don't want people to hear it. Tell something. No, that is just not right. Because we have been brought to Singapore from India to study how a first world country looks like. And when we are in India, we think about there's a freedom of expression, there's freedom of press, there's debate, there's discussions, everything that you call about the United States of America that you talk about.
Yeah. Can you, if you don't mind, just ask.
I get a little excited when I come about it because you said it's one question. I don't want to get killed off like the previous one. So
thank you.
That's it. Okay.
Thank you very much. We have to go to the question. Next one, yeah, please.
I'm Tan Keng Soon from the Tan Eng Kiam Foundation. Earlier, Mr. Fukuyama, you said that the U.S. tried to transplant its institutions to the Middle East countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, tried to bring democracy to them, and it's not very good at it. My question is, what role, if any, did the culture and religion of the people in the Middle East have to do with its failure? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for keeping your questions short. Can I encourage all of you, please, to keep your questions short? Because otherwise, and this is about being democratic, giving everybody a chance, okay? If all of you ask long questions, nobody can ask questions. Please, next one.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Fukuyama for an utmost beautiful lecture. My name is George Komnenes. I will keep it short. So, you gave a beautiful overview of 3 variables, if I'm not mistaken. Power, from the state wanting more power, on the other hand the rule of law, and on the other hand you spoke about accountability, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a beautiful overview, and afterwards you gave 2 poles in that respect, opposite poles, the United States and China, and you didn't give actually your own opinion on what would be the most perfect system. But my question is, could you give maybe an indication of how you would place Singapore and the Singaporean government in respect to these 3 variables and in respect to this pole, 2 poles that you have made, and perhaps also in doing that touch upon the trias politica. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. 3 questions.
So maybe I can actually answer the first and the third at the same time. So yes, I do not believe that you can have true accountability without freedom of the press, because if people don't know what the government is doing, they can't hold it accountable, and the government won't feel accountable. So that's very important. So Singapore, when I'm lecturing, Singapore always occupies one of the squares in the matrix, because Singapore obviously has a very successful modern state. It also, compared to China, has a pretty strong rule of law, which is a very important asset. The democracy part is the problematic part, because it's a one-party system in which you don't have full freedom of media and don't have fully free competition. And my sense is that the workability of that system was very, very much dependent on the personal character of the founding generation of Singaporean leaders. But the problem with that kind of a system is, how do you keep renewing that leadership? Or the way I put it to my students is, it's fine, you have a good emperor, Lee Kuan Yew, but where do you assure this continuing supply of Lee Kuan Yews, down the years? And that's very hard, and I don't think any non-democratic system has ever solved that problem. Where's the next Lee Kuan Yew going to come from?
The other question about culture.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So yes, culture is definitely a problem, although you can use institutions to overcome cultural, things like ethnic division, and a number of societies have done that, quite successfully. So I think that clearly there is I guess I resist certain conclusions, for example. So it is very common for a lot of people to say, well, the problem is Islam. There's something inherently violent that creates, suicide bombers and radical Islamism and so forth. And I think that is very ignorant of the actual history of Islam, because, all cultural systems can be interpreted in many, many different ways. We didn't have suicide bombers 50 years ago, so something else is triggering that kind of phenomenon other than culture. And I, as general advice to my students, I tell them, don't turn to a cultural explanation until you've exhausted all the other ones, like short-term incentives and institutions and, that sort of thing, because I think it's the refuge of intellectually lazy people to say, well, it's just a cultural problem.
Okay, now we're going to go to the gentleman at the back. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Mabugani and Prof. Fukuyama. You kind of preempted my question, and perhaps I'd like to add a little bit to the Indian gentleman earlier, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, our wise emperor, once said that he doesn't believe in the exuberance of perhaps like a liberal democracy, because it hinders development. Hence, he wants a more controlled path towards development and democracy. That's perhaps why we have a rather more subdued, but if you look into the inner layers, a strong debate as any liberal democracy, in Singapore. I'd just like to ask you, if you just said that culture should be the last reason, but you wrote a previous book, which I enjoyed very much, on trust. And I'd just like to ask, for United States, right? It seems that a lot of Americans have, for example, Krugman has said that they've lost faith in the American dream and in the American institutions. And for China as well, they don't seem to have a high level of trust. So could you comment on that, whether how to rebuild the trust back in both nations so that they can have more faith in their governments?
Okay.
That's an easy question, yeah. Please.
Good evening, Professor Fukuyama. My name is Darian Mohan. I graduated from a Singaporean high school last year. My question is, what do you think the implications on America's political decay would be should the House, the Senate, and the White House all be controlled by a single party? Thank you.
We're going to get a single party state in the United States. Over there.
Okay. Thank you, Dean and Professor. My name is Sun Xi, MPV graduate from the Decay School. Very short question. when will be the end of history? Have you changed your answer compared to 2 decades ago?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So you got 3 questions here.
So
Rebuilding trust. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. So how to rebuild trust? That's a hard question to answer, and it depends, I guess, on what kind of trust, because distrust of government is different from social distrust of fellow citizens or your neighbors, and they've got different kinds of solutions. So I think on a micro level, you build trust by bonding people around common values or experiences or history. And I think any corporate leader understands that if you want to increase trust within the organization, there are ways of doing that. What's much harder is to do that on a society-wide basis. And what's very hard to do is for a government to rebuild trust once it's been broken. But I think ultimately people distrust governments because they don't work. They're ineffective. They don't deliver on what they promise. So if you're going to rebuild trust, the government actually has to figure out how to do something effectively. And that's the way that you can get out of this low trust equilibrium. The implications of decay in the United States, well, yeah, if you had one party controlling all 3 branches of government, yes, you wouldn't have deadlock and government shutdowns, and we would be able to make a certain set of decisions more equally. And I think both parties are hoping that that'll happen to them. But I want to point out something in the American system. So the Democrats controlled all 3 branches for a very long period from basically 1932 up until the 1980s. And yet we didn't get civil rights legislation through until the 1960s because a minority of southern states were able to block civil rights legislation. And so this is the characteristic of our check and balance system. Even if you have a majority party that controls 3 branches, it's still possible to veto things. And that's why a lot of Democrats are hoping that demographic changes will produce democratic control of the whole government over time. But that's not going to solve some of the problems. And then
the end of history.
Yeah, so my views have changed in the following ways. So first, I think that I'm much more aware of the difficulty of creating institutions than I was, and part of that just has to do with the work I've done in governance issues in poor countries, in the developing world, where it's really very difficult to, especially as I said, create modern states. And I realized that this was kind of a mystery about how they came about in the first place, and that's why I wrote these last 2 books, is to try to explain to myself how that actually happened. And then, obviously when I wrote The End of History, the theme of decay wasn't there. I wasn't talking about how political systems would potentially go backwards, and so I think that's also, a new element in the way I think about things.
Okay, we are supposed to finish at 6:45. Can we carry on to 7 o'clock?
It's up to
you.
you.
Is that okay with you? You all agree? So I'm sorry, it means you'll have your dinner 15 minutes later, but we'll carry on trying to get as many questions as we can. Again, if you don't mind, everyone, keep it short, sharp.
Okay. Hi, Professor Francis Fukuyama. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Decay, and I'm a student at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My question would come in 2 parts, and it's really a one question. Perhaps you talked about the strong leadership being a good start to political institutions and democracy in general, but what is your take on the idea that elites could be a group of benevolent elites or trustees to a democracy in a way that there's enough reason to trust a small group of people at the top of democracy or society to sufficiently represent citizen demands. So, and the second part of the question is that how do you ensure this sort of oligarchy or elite group to have limits before they veer into populism? Because that's sort of like a bit of in terms of probably some Asian democracies, there's also a tendency to become more populist as the democracy starts to evolve. Thank you very much.
Over here, please. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, for your talk this evening. I'm Chatrini Veeratunga, and I'm a student at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I'm from Sri Lanka. As you mentioned, Sri Lanka has just recently elected a new government, which is trying to rebuild the democratic institutions. And my question is, what is your advice to this new government in creating and establishing a political order?
Okay.
Okay, one more.
Okay, I'm Alexander Korolev from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and my question is about consistency of social science work, because in early 90s you published your famous piece, The End of History, in which you were saying that what we were witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, it's the universalization of liberal values and the growth of marketization. But in 2008, you published a piece in Newsweek titled The End of America, in which you were saying that together with Wall Street's firms, the certain vision of capitalism collapsed and American brand severely damaged. Was severely damaged. So obviously there are two ends in your story. One is the end of history, the other one is the end of America. So could you please explain the logic of shifting from one end to the other? Thank you.
Okay. So on the question of elites, there's no question that all societies have elites and that certain elite-run societies can actually run very well. But the question in all of those cases is how do you guarantee the continuity and the reproduction of elites over the generations? Now, dynastic China solved that problem in a certain way because many of the cultural institutions were designed to reproduce those elites. That's what Confucianism was really about. So the education system, the examination system, and so forth was meant to ensure that you'd have a class of bureaucrats that would rule the country and that they would have a certain level of education and that it didn't depend on the whim of a particular emperor, political leader, for that to happen. And I think one of the issues that faces modern China right now is that, in a sense, they're the heirs of that tradition. Meritocracy is important, but they've also got other principles like Marxism and other ideas mixed in, and it's not clear how this elite manages to reproduce itself, consistently over time. I think you were alluding to populism in Asia. I don't know whether you're referring to Thailand, but that's probably the country that, comes to mind where, you've had the breakdown of Thai democracy because essentially you had an elite running that country. Then you had Thaksin's election. He's a populist. He's, personally corrupt, but he's also democratically representative of this large rural population in Thailand, and basically the Thai elite doesn't like it, and they, and actually between the red shirts and the yellow shirts, I sort of feel like saying a plague on both your houses because, on the one hand, Thaksin represented, something, he was not a good governance guy, right? But on the other hand, that elite just doesn't want to give up power, even when it's pretty clear that the majority of the Thai population is actually benefiting from his agricultural subsidies and so forth. And so I think that both of them really need to rethink their positions. On Sri Lanka, I think the task in front of the current government is really clear. There has to be a reconciliation after this terrible war, between the major ethnic groups in Sri Lanka. And so far, so good. So far the new president seems to be aware that that is the agenda. And it was interesting, his support, comes from the non-Sinhalese groups, and he has tried to be more inclusive, and that's really important. But beyond that, he's also got to deliver, on basic services and getting the economies, moving and this sort of thing, if you are going to act, because that's really what helps to ease these kinds of ethnic tensions. Now, the last question on whether I contradicted myself, no, the answer is absolutely not, because I never associated the end of history with the specifically American form of either democracy or capitalism. In fact, Alexander Kojève, who is the philosopher that I was quoting in the end of history, who said that history ended in 1806 at the Battle of Jena, actually would have said, and I would have agreed with him, that the European Union comes much closer to representing the end of history than the United States does. You know, the United States has got a very peculiar form both of market capitalism and of democracy. So as I said, we have many more checks and balances than a typical European parliamentary democracy. And in the 1980s and 90s, we got carried away with market liberalism. You know, we deregulated too much. And that's the model that was, the political model of using force, you know, in the way the Bush administration did, and the economic model of a completely deregulated financial sector, those blew up. Those were policy mistakes, they blew up, but that's not the same thing as either market capitalism or liberal democracy blowing up. That was just a very specific American interpretation.
Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's the last 6 we will take, no more after this. So I'll take them in phases of 3 again. So 1 over the back there, 2 and 3. Please.
Good evening. My name is Samuel. I am an undergraduate student at the National University of Singapore. I have a question to you with regards to something you wrote in 2004 in Foreign Policy. And in 2004, you named transhumanism as the most dangerous idea in the world. 10 years later, do you still stand by the claim? Thank you.
Okay. Next one here. Again, sharp
I'm
question.
Tan King Soon from Tan Kiam Foundation again. Thank you very much for answering my earlier question. I thoroughly enjoyed your answer. Now, this question is regarding India and China. As we all know, China has grown and progressed faster than India. So, since you say culture is the last refuge of the lazy, so it must be institutional reasons for that. So my question is this: why is dictatorial China doing better than democratic India? Thank you.
No.
Okay, over there, please.
Hello, good evening, Professor. My name is Tao Minghui and I'm from Raffles Institution. So my question is really simple. You said that China and the US are they're at the opposite ends in terms of political order. So I was just interested to ask, are there going to be any similarities between them in terms of political decay, or are they still going to be extremely different? Thank you.
Okay. So on the transhumanism thing.
What is transhumanism?
Well, it's just genetic engineering and, you know, trying to make better human beings and so forth, which was the subject of the book that I wrote in 2001 called Our Posthuman Future. So one of the problems is that when you write articles, you don't actually write the title. Some editor writes the title. And that particular article, and including, I think, the one about America blowing up or something, I didn't write those titles. That was just some editor that wanted to give it a sexy, you know, I mean, they wanted to attract...
You sell a lot of books, you can't complain.
Well, no, the end of history was my title, but these other ones weren't. So whether it's the most dangerous problem, I don't know, but I think it is a problem because I think that technology is giving us new opportunities to control the behavior of other human beings. And we've tried that a lot in the 20th century, and it always has these very bad unintended consequences. And I do worry about the fact that this kind of biotechnology will do the same. On the India-China question, that's a topic of a separate lecture, but I would say that India has been held back in recent years because its political system has not been able to deliver strong government, in effect. So just infrastructure. Like the Chinese really can do infrastructure and India can't. It can't build airports, roads, dams, you know, all that sort of thing. And that is a big problem for them. And so, as I said, I think that's one of the reasons that Mr. Modi was elected, because a lot of Indians, especially in the business community, are hoping that he can break through all this blather of, Indian politics over the last few years and actually get some stuff done. Now, whether China and the United States will converge, all countries are engaged in a process of competitive decay, and sometimes the country that ends up on top is the one that decays the least fast. And one issue, affecting China, although China does not have interest groups the way the United States does, it does have interest groups. State-owned enterprises, there's, different parts of the government and the party all constitute very powerful entrenched interests. And the last government in China wasn't very effective in overcoming, their resistance to, I think, a number of economic reforms that were actually quite important. And so that might be a problem. My hope is that actually there will be a certain convergence, because I would like to see the United States be less deadlocked and more decisive, and I want to see the Chinese government more limited and constrained in terms of its decision-making, primarily, I think, not so much in the short run by democracy, but more by the rule of law, that they need laws to limit the discretion of, powerful people in that society.
Okay, last three questions, quickly. Yeah?
Hi, good evening, Professor. My name is Ng Chi Siang, and I'm a graduate from Raffles Institution. Lately, in the political discourse of many places, especially in the United States, there seems to be this overall trend in the world of some form of inequality in many economies. So the question I would like to ask you is, how is this form of inequality going to go and result in, what kind of impact this inequality will have in the development of states in future, especially with many groups now saying that the current way that statecraft occurs doesn't work?
Okay, last two questions.
Good evening, Prof. My name is Echo. I'm a PhD candidate from the Political Science Department of NUS. I have a question regarding the definition and scope of public interest in your framework. Taking the case of Russia as an example, if the people elect or advocate an authoritarian leader, knowing his leadership style and personality, then wouldn't that phenomenon itself reflect the public interest? Or if you take public interest as a universal set of values, then that really implies that these people do not know what they want. So may I know your opinion on this? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Liang Ce. I'm a graduate student from NUS, Department of Political Science. My question for you is, Schumpeter, in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he argues that democracy should be seen as a method, not an end. So I want to know what is your take on that. Thank you.
Okay. So the question on inequality, I think, is probably one of the chief really difficult problems that, and it's not just democracies. I mean, inequality has been increasing, very, very rapidly in China as well. And I think that a lot of it has a very common source, which is technology. That middle-class jobs have been eroded by the fact that intelligent machines can increasingly do work that low-skilled and increasingly sort of mid-skilled people used to be able to do, and all the rewards are going to people with, good cognitive abilities and good educations and that sort of thing. And I frankly do not see a clear solution to this. I mean, I do think that to some extent you're going to have to do redistribution, but the old kind of socialist or social democratic kind of welfare state solutions, we've seen the limits of that also. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's very important from the standpoint of democracy, because if you have a few very rich people and a lot of people that aren't doing well, that's not a good condition for, I think, good politics in general, because it sets up, a really polarized society, with elites and with a popular, populist, very unhappy mass of people. So the question about whether there's a public interest or whether the public interest is simply whatever people at any given moment choose. It's a difficult question in democratic theory. I actually happen to believe that public interest is not simply the aggregation of preferences of the people at one particular time, because first of all, those views change. So Russian people may actually decide they hate Mr. Putin in 5 years, and I think that the broader public interest of Russia is probably contained not in the first choice or necessarily the second choice, but is something a little different, representing their broad interests over a longer period of time. What that is exactly is a little bit hard to say, but I don't think that you can simply say that public interest is simply what people vote for, because people, in democracies, a lot of times people make really stupid choices and do things that they come to.
Then you change the people.
Yeah, you change the people, yeah. Well, that's why democracy, it needs education and it needs deliberation, if you don't have deliberation in democracy and kind of exchange of information and shape preferences over time, it's not going to work. And I'm sorry, the last question
Is democracy a means, not an end?
Oh, no. So in my humble opinion, democracy is an end in itself, because I believe that part of the human personality wants agency. It wants choice, and it wants choice in the political realm, that you can't be a full adult if you don't have a share of rule. This is a classic understanding of liberty, that you're not a fully free person, you're not a full adult unless you can share in political power in your community. And therefore, I think that even in a well-run autocracy where everybody's rich and secure and taken care of in material terms, if you do not have a share of political power, you have a stunted and incomplete life. And that's why I think there is an intrinsic value to democracy, that it recognizes citizens as full adults and not as, and to some extent, every authoritarian regime, to some extent treats its citizens as if they're children. And I think, people grow up and they want to be adults. So,
I'm sure you all agree that we've been blessed that Frank has shared his wide and deep learning with all of us. The bad news is that we only had 90 minutes with him. The good news is that you can pick up and read what he wrote 7 days a week. So I strongly encourage you all to buy his books out there, and you'll discover a lot more wisdom in those pages there also. So now please join me in thanking Frank for his wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we have your attention, please? This is a gentle reminder. We will appreciate if you could spare a few minutes to fill in our feedback form. It can be found in every seat. You may drop the completed form at the information counter just outside the venue. Thank you very much.